The Nisnas, on the other hand, is an entirely different kind of anomalous creature. Believed to have originated from Yemen, this creature is essentially a cryptid, biologically classified as a monopod, and very different from jinn. It is made out of flesh and blood. In 1001 Arabian Nights, it is described as half a human being, having a half head, half a body, one arm, one leg, with which it hops with much agility. According to Yemeni tradition, they would disguise themselves as decrepit old men, seeking help in order to attract their victims before with their one hand. Although it is largely considered as a fictional entity, Somali folklore speaks of a similar creature that goes by the name of Zunguruf or Hunguruf. This similarity may be due to the close proximity of Yemen to East Africa, where culture and folk traditions cross-contaminate each other. However, stories about monsters that match the unique description of the Nisnas can also be found buried deep in the folklores of traditions as far as East China, which makes us question, could this creature have been real at one point in history? Outside the books of religion, science, and law, there are a number of important works within the Arabic and Persian literary tradition that delves into the fictional and sometimes real realms of the occult. From magic monsters and the jinn to abstract concepts of time and space. These books include the Book of Wonders, a book on astronomy, astrology, and divination. Kitab al-Kunuz, sometimes called the Book of Hidden Pearls, a lost medieval manuscript from the 15th century of magic spells designed to find ancient Egyptian treasure. Akhbar al-Zaman, the Book of History, a collection of writings on medieval lore about the world before the flood and the wonders of Egypt before and after the deluge. عجائب المخلوقات وغرائب الموجودات, translated in English as the marvels of things created and miraculous aspects of things existing, which is essentially an ancient book on cryptozoology. Kitab Shams al-Ma'arif wa Lata'if al-Awarif, a cursed 13th century grimoire that served as a template for H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon. And Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, a fictional anthology of stories that trace their roots back to an ancient and medieval Arab, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, Persian, and Mesopotamian folklore. In this episode of Mysterious Middle East, we will take a dive into a few of the darkest elements and influences of this book and examine where the line between jinn, monsters, and magic blurs the line between fiction and reality. First put to form in the Islamic Golden Age, the epic work collectively known as 1001 Nights began life as a series of translations of an incomplete manuscript. Outside of Islam, this book perhaps serves as a key point of reference and introduction to the Muslim world, or at least a highly stylized and mythical version of it. In the West, these stories inspired modern pioneers of horror and science fiction such as Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. In order to understand the real-life supernatural influence of this book in the modern age, especially with regards to Lovecraft and the occultist Aleister Crowley, we must first briefly look at the history of the book. Some historians believe that the earliest tales in it may have originated from India and Persia. Then, sometime in the early 8th century, these were translated into Arabic under the title of Alf Layla, or 1000 Nights. And from here, storytellers from Iraq, Egypt, and Syria between the 9th and 13th century added their own layers of stories, creating the finalized version of 1001 Nights before it was introduced to the West. In the modern age, the 1001 Nights became known as the 1001 Arabian Nights for Western audiences when it was translated into French and English. Although all of the stories in this anthology are fictional, the work does intercept with reality, or with what was once perceived as reality in the Middle East, where it not only incorporated real-life historical figures into its narrative, but also various types of supernatural entities that are believed not only to exist then, but also today. There are a large number of creatures referenced in this book, including the Nisnas and the Ifrit. The Ifrit is a powerful spirit made out of fire, often associated with the underworld. Within Islam, this entity is described as a type of jinn and is often identified as being cunning, seductive, and extremely dangerous, with the potential to cause much harm. In the Holy Quran, in Surah 27, a Ifrit offers to carry the throne of the Queen of Saba, Balqis, to Solomon, but is then denied. While in the Hadiths of Sahih al-Bukhari, a collection of Islamic sayings from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, a Ifrit even attempts to sabotage the Prophet during his miraculous night journey before being defeated by the Archangel Gabriel. Outside of Islam, the creature's malicious nature becomes even more terrifying. In a Moroccan tradition, they are believed to be the spirits of murdered innocent people who come back to haunt the living as extremely powerful, anomalous entities. In Egypt, they are portrayed somewhat differently, where they are more like the classic jinn and are limited to only possessing the limbs of a human, a process that sometimes leads to disease or decay. However, some also have the ability to possess an entire body, giving that individual superhuman strength, but at the ultimate cost of sending the possessed insane. The Nisnas, on the other hand, is an entirely different kind of anomalous creature. Believed to have originated from Yemen, this creature is essentially a cryptid, biologically classified as a monopod, and very different from jinn. It is made out of flesh and blood. In 1001 Arabian Nights, it is described as half a human being, having a half head, half a body, one arm, one leg, with which it hops with much agility. According to Yemeni tradition, they would disguise themselves as decrepit old men, seeking help in order to attract their victims before beating them to death with their one hand. Although it is largely considered as a fictional entity, Somali folklore speaks of a similar creature that goes by the name of Zunguruf or Hunguruf. This similarity may be due to the close proximity of Yemen to East Africa, where culture and folk traditions cross-contaminate each other. However, stories about monsters that match the unique description of the Nisnas can also be found buried deep in the folklores of traditions, as far as East China, which makes us question, could this creature have been real at one point in history? Literary theorist Maria Jesus Viguera states that in Yemen, the Nisnas was either believed to be a real creature based on encounters with existing animals such as apes or seals, or it was a symbolic creature written into folklore to serve as a manifestation of man's moral or physical degradation. On the other hand, Roy Volosny, in his article Between Mythmaking and Shiite Exegesis, argues that the Nisnas may have been a pre-human species. He states a theory that the world is only 50,000 years old, and its history can be divided into 5 separate cycles of 10,000 years each. Roy writes that during the 4th cycle, God created the jinn and the Nisnas. It wasn't until the 5th cycle that Adam and his descendants finally roamed the earth. Now, while creatures like the Ifrit and the Nisnas make exciting additions to 1001 Nights, their existence and impact on lore is largely only known in Arab and Islamic cultures. What is more well known to the West about this book is its portrayal of magic and powerful spiritual entities that can appear almost godlike. These entities were popularized due to the works of Sir Francis Burton and other translators, as well as H.P. Lovecraft and Aleister Crowley. The first European version of 1001 Nights was translated into French by Antoine Galland in the 8th century, but the most famous translation was made by Sir Richard Francis Burton, a 19th century explorer and Orientalist, in 1885. One of the most famous associates of Burton was the occultist Aleister Crowley. A number of Middle Eastern academics, including Edward Said, highlight that the key problem with Western translations of fictional Middle Eastern texts is that they often emphasize the exotic otherness of Arabs and Muslims, and all the stereotypes that go with that. The otherness is usually portrayed as a world and people who are equal parts savage, exotic, and free of any real rule of law, as compared to their Western counterparts. Said called this Orientalism, and this term can be applied to 1001 Arabian Nights. Academics say that it is through the lens of Orientalism that the worldview of H.P. Lovecraft and Crowley was formed. We have already discussed to great length how Lovecraft adapted North African and Middle Eastern folklore and religion to flesh out the fictional world of his stories. The links to those episodes can be found in the description box below. However, while Lovecraft openly acknowledged that his stories about vast cosmic entities, jinn, and magic were nothing more than science fiction and should not be taken seriously, Aleister Crowley believed in the lore of these stories almost quite literally. His obsession with the otherness of the Arabs and Islamic world was skewed, and from this he developed his own homemade belief system that has its roots in extremely dark magic, of course heavily influenced by the translation of 1001 Nights. Crowley devoted his adult life to an exploration of the occult, and even established his own cult called the Gnostic Mass of the Ordo Templi Orientis. His impact on modern-day entertainment, in particularly Western entertainment, is significant. Musicians, including David Bowie, are said to have embraced Crowley's dark mystery and hedonistic tendencies, while Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page even bought Crowley's estate in the 1970s because of his admiration for him. In modern times, the rapper Jay-Z has been associated with Crowley, where he was once pictured wearing a sweatshirt with the phrase, "Do what thou wilt," printed across the chest. The full expression is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and was one of the key maxims of Aleister Crowley with regards to rebelling against the West. Dr. R. Blackhurst, a lecturer in religious studies at La Trobe University, Australia, states that Mr. Crowley falls into the category of Orientalist, and that his occultism is based on a Western interpretation of Middle Eastern lore. That is to say, it consists of appropriations from the real or imagined East, especially the imagined. Crowley took pleasure in living a life free from the rules of the then devoutly Christian society. In part of his rebellion against society, he wrongfully viewed the East as a symbol of this debauchery and antithesis to the Christian West. His most rebellious action was to indulge in the darkest aspect of the occult. He hated Christianity, and so wrongfully believed that in adopting Middle Eastern culture and mysticism, he would be further distancing himself from Western normality and values. Completely bypassing Islamic beliefs and principles, he skipped straight to the worlds portrayed in books like 1001 Arabian Nights. For Edward Said, such misrepresentation of the Orient were the counter-image of the West, a fantasy that Crowley fell for as reality. Crowley, along with his associate H.P. Lovecraft, were even known to dress in ancient and contemporary Egyptian and Arab clothes, with the latter even creating an Arabic alter ego of himself called Abdul Hazrat, a nonsense name that does not make a lick of sense in Arabic, but became its own character in his books, where it penned the fictional work known as the Necronomicon. Back in the real world, it was at Cambridge University where Crowley first read Richard Burton's translation of 1001 Nights. He admired Burton's translation so much, he even included him in the list of saints invoked in a Gnostic Mass of the Ordo Templi Orientis ritual, emphasizing how important his book is to his cult. A key area where Crowley and Burton shared an interest in was that of sex. While Burton released volumes of Eastern knowledge on all matters regarding sexuality, something that is heavily evident in his translation of 1001 Nights, Crowley was famous for his sex magic rituals. He had many lovers, both female and male, with some of whom he would practice these rituals. In fact, the most famous aspect of Crowley, as it relates to Middle Eastern and North African cultures, is his practice of magic in Egypt. In 1904, while in Cairo, his wife, Rose Kelly, started to have supernatural revelations that contributed to writing his Book of the Law from an ancient Egyptian entity which he believed was his guardian angel and the Egyptian equivalent of Satan. He communicated with this creature via a ritual, which eventually sent his wife into a trance, where she explained that another ancient Egyptian deity, Horus, was waiting for him. Crowley tested Rose, who apparently had no knowledge of Egyptian gods, by making her describe Horus in a museum. She picked out the one she was most attracted to, and it had the exhibit number of 666. With that, Crowley then started to describe himself as the beast, referring to the biblical description of the Antichrist. His book, the Book of Law, proclaimed that humanity was entering a new eon and that Crowley would serve as its prophet. It stated that a supreme moral law was to be introduced in this eon. That law was, "Do what thou wilt" shall be the whole of the law, and that people should learn to live in tune with their will. So basically hedonism. Whether Crowley's supernatural encounter in Egypt was real or not, his philosophy of hedonism has more or less become accepted in the Western society. Ultimately, while works such as 1001 Nights serve as a good historical document about the myth and lore of the ancient Middle East and Asia, it is always essential to be fully aware of where the line between reality begins and interpreted fantasy ends. Thanks for watching. This is a crossover episode between the mysterious Middle East and my personal channel, The Optimistic Arab, where part 2 of this video can be found, where I personally dig deeper into 1001 Arabian Nights, Orientalism, from a literary and analytical perspective of a 21st century Arab. Please like, share, and subscribe here on the mysterious Middle East so we can continue to make more content, and also come across to my channel, Optimistic Arab, as well, and do the same.